Welcome back to World War II TV and the third of three myths shows we have done today. One about 8 hours ago about Guadalcanal, one just half an hour ago, and now this final one today. The performance of the French army in 1940 has been much maligned. To talk about that subject is living historian Tom Jones. Bring him in now. Good evening, Tom. How are you?
I'm very well indeed, Paul. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to crack on. You've got a PowerPoint. You're going to take us through there. Folks, we'll try and deal with some of the questions. There's no one else following, Tom, so we should be good. So basically, over to you, Tom. Let's have a look at this.
Okay, so this is titled Not a Stroll in Rural France, and we'll come back to that quote later on. This is basically based on a number of myths that have appeared in the kind of comments of some World War II TV videos over the last sort of month or so. So I wanted to address those. So they're specifically related to World War II TV. Okay, so myth one is that the French did everything they could to avoid fighting. This is going to be a bit whistle stop, because obviously we've only got 20 minutes or so. But in order to understand how the French were going to do what they were going to do, you need to understand the French doctrine and the French battle plans. So French doctrine is largely based on something called la bataille conduite, or what we know as the methodical battle. And it was kind of based on their experiences from the First World War. It was ostensibly, in the truest sense of the word, defensive in nature, but obviously, ostensibly, it wasn't wholly defensive in nature. So what they were going to do is they were going to utilize the Maginot Line. And for those that don't know, the Maginot Line is a sequence of mutually supportive but not interconnected fortress positions along the Franco-German and Franco-Italian border. And there's a lot of myths about the Maginot Line itself, but what it allowed the French to do was to let the Maginot Line take care of itself. It allowed them to focus their attention on the parts of the border that either you wouldn't want to fortify or you couldn't fortify. It stops Belgium for a specific reason, in the sense that the French and the Belgians had in 1920 the Franco-Belgian Accord, which was a loose defensive pact, basically. So it allowed the French to enter Belgian territory upon declaration of war. What that would mean is the French could fight the Germans, who they assumed would come through Belgium, as they did in the First World War. They could confront the Germans on territory that wasn't French, because obviously the devastation that had occurred in France in the First World War was not something they wanted to repeat. That got scuppered in 1936 when the Belgians withdrew from this Franco-Belgian Accord and reasserted their neutrality. So they would only allow the French onto Belgian territory when Belgium was specifically being invaded, i.e. when the bullets were flying and Germans were coming across the border. To do that, the French came up with something called Plan D, or the Deal Plan. And what they were going to do was they were going to get their most powerful, most mobile forces, and they were going to rush headlong into Belgium, get to a line roughly along the Deal River, and they were going to dig in and defend that line. They were going to employ la bataille conduite, so they were going to employ this kind of massive, crushing defensive battle, and meet the Germans there. They extended it in early 1940 by adding what they call the Breda variant, which was this extension of the Deal Plan to go further up to Breda-Moerdijk in the Netherlands to link up and have this kind of continuous Dutch, Belgian, French, British front. What basically this means is that the French were taking strong, powerful, mobile forces into Belgium, where they assumed the bulk of the German attack was going to come. So they were going to meet the Germans head on. That is not in any meaningful sense avoiding a fight. This is backed up by a lot of the intelligence they had. So there's something called the Mechelin incident, which kind of reinforced this idea that the Germans were going to come through Belgium. But the point is, if you want to avoid a fight with the Germans, you don't go into Belgium, you just stay in France. You don't take your mobile forces there. It's nonsensical. On a lower level, they had also within this French doctrine, they had something called colmate, and I apologize to any French speakers, I don't speak French, but it's loosely called like filling or plugging. So what they were intending to do was, when gaps appeared in the line, they would specifically insert French forces between the threatened French troops and the Germans to basically act as a kind of tripwire for the Germans. They would bump into the Germans and almost hit them head on and just slow them down. That was kind of their job. So again, even at lower levels, you are talking about French troops taking a defensive fight, if you can do such a thing, to the Germans, if you see what I mean. So this kind of idea that they were doing everything they could to avoid a fight is fundamentally not true. Their doctrine was defensive in nature, but that doesn't mean that they were trying to avoid fighting. What they were going to do was wear the Germans down on their defenses with this kind of crushing tank, artillery, infantry assault, which is what the methodical battle is. And then they were going to go on the attack later on. So in 1936, Maurice Gamelin, who's the man that you can see on the right, studying intently the Balkans, no idea why, he added some lines into French doctrine which stated that what they were going to do after this defensive action was to then go on the attack, take the spirit of the offensive in the way that they'd done in the First World War. Which leads me on to the next point, that the vast majority, not all of them, but the vast majority of the French higher command were ex-World War I soldiers. So in the First World War, they'd taken the spirit of the offensive, they'd gone over onto the offensive, took the fight to the Germans really quite aggressively. And here's the point, they'd won. It was not as if they were afraid of fighting the Germans. They thought they knew how to do it. They weren't in any way avoiding a fight in any meaningful sense. So that's myth one. Myth two is that when they met the Germans, they didn't fight very well. And this is not exhaustive, and this isn't meant to be how the French won in 1940. Spoiler alert, they didn't. But these are examples of when the French actually really fought very well. So the first one is the Battle of Hanout, which was fought between the French Corps de Cavalry, which was headed by a bloke called René Priou, and the German 16th Army Corps. And it was almost a meeting engagement around the towns of Hanout and Meda in Belgium. And for the loss of 121 French tanks, they knocked out 163 German. So they were quite capable, when they were sort of well trained and well led, of inflicting significant casualties on the Germans. The next one is the Battle of Jean-Bleu, which is the kind of, you want to see it as the anchor point of the main French line in Belgium, was around the Jean-Bleu Gap. So it was a natural funnel for the Germans to come through Belgium. And the main French line was anchored on this town. And over the 14th and 15th of May, there were a lot of engagements between the French and the Germans here. And it is widely understood that the French won those engagements and their line held. So they were doing this defensive battle. They were doing it very well. They were absolutely pummeling the Germans with really crushing artillery fire, which was their thing, basically. The only reason why the Battle of Jean-Bleu ends is because the French themselves withdraw once they hear about the news at Sedan. And then to go towards the kind of Sedan sector, we have the Battle of Ston, which occurred between the 15th and the 17th of May 1940. And for those that don't know, Ston is a tiny little village above the Sedan Plateau. It's on some high ground, and it changed hands 17 times in 3 days, which is the type of fighting that we would later, that kind of alternating fighting we'd see in say, Stalingrad. Then we have the defense of Lille of the 28th to the 31st of May 1940. Now, this is an interesting one because the defense of Lille was one of the major factors in allowing a significantly greater number of Allied troops to escape at Dunkirk. And when the siege of Lille ended, the German commander honoured the French soldiers by having them parade in front of him and his men, which is what you can see in the title card. So obviously there's the Germans and the French marching in front of them at the end of the battle. So they were so impressed by the French defence that they gave them what is called the honours of war. Incidentally, if anyone goes to Lille, this square is all roughly still there. It's called Place de Charles de Gaulle now. Although the Café Moderne is now a McDonald's, disappointingly. And then we have Narvik, which kind of happened over sort of between April and June 1940. But Narvik was one of the first towns to actually be retaken from the Germans in the entire war. And there were a significant number of French chasseurs alpins who fought there, and they did so really rather well. And this kind of links back to myth one as well, that if you want to avoid a fight, don't go all the way to Norway to have one.
Mm.
And then we go on to Case Red. So the Battle of France in 1940 occurred in roughly two phases from the German perspective, in that there was Case Yellow, which kind of wrapped up around the end of the Dunkirk evacuation. And then there was Case Red or Fall Rot, which was fought by the Germans against predominantly the French, although you do get divisions like 51st Highland there. And we only need to know how well the French fought by asking the Germans who fought them. So Hauptmann Ernst von Jungenfeld, who was a captain in a panzer regiment, they were attacking the 16th Division d'Infanterie, or infantry division, at Dury on the 5th of June. And he says, behind us is the glare of a vicious battle where one fights not for each village but for each house. We are not therefore surprised to find ourselves under fire from all quarters, and one could say nobody knows which is the front and which is the rear. When summoned to surrender, the enemy refuses and redoubles his fire. These soldiers are from the active regular troops. They do not know hesitation or weakness. And there's another quote by General Albrecht Schubert of the 23rd Army Corps, and it suffered about 1,000 casualties trying to breach the lines of the 14th Division, which was commanded by General Delattre de Tassigny. And he says, the attack ran up against an enemy whose morale was unshaken. On June the 9th and 10th, the 14th Division d'Infanterie fought in a manner which recalls the French troops of 1914-18 at Verdun, which is about as big a compliment as the Germans could pay them. And I do have an additional quote, actually. This is from a German after-action report when they were fighting the 13th Division of Infantry. And it says, the battle was hard and costly in lives, the enemy putting up a stout resistance, particularly in the woods and tree lines, continuing the fight when our attacking troops had pushed on past their points of resistance. So all of this basically goes to show that, particularly in Case Red, when the French were committed to their defence, and they had adequate resources to do so, they could put up really, really staunch resistance. And this wasn't something that the Germans forgot easily. This wasn't an easy victory for them. They lost a huge number of casualties, in particularly Case Red, and significantly amongst their officer corps, who were obviously much harder to replace. Okay. The next myth is related to French weapons and equipment, which came up as it always comes up because you see machine guns like this, and people always make out that all of them had MG34s, and they were all significantly better. So French uniforms. I collect this stuff. I do have some French uniforms, and they are as good as everybody else's. Is all I would say. They are idiosyncratically French, so they have a lot of the French features, but they are not rubbish uniforms. They're not crap, as someone sort of suggested they were. The uniforms, aside from being really practical, they were very stylish. The French went to war in +4s and an Eton collared jumper, for instance. And notably, unlike the German uniforms, the French uniforms were pure wool. So they were 100% wool. Even towards the start of the 1940 campaign, the quantity of viscose rayon that was being added into German wool uniforms was astonishingly high. And at the point in 1940, it reaches about 50-50. So the Germans are wearing a lot of synthetic fibers, which is obviously not as good when you're out in the field. But the French, they had pure woolen uniforms. And as I say, they were quite practical. And their light and their heavy weapons were good. Their artillery was excellent. Ask the Germans who fought at the Jean-Bleu Gap what they thought of French artillery, and they would attest that it was actually both devastating in terms of the volume of fire, and it was also incredibly accurate. It also helps that the French had a lot of ammunition, because their battle doctrine, as I said earlier, is based on meeting a threat and killing it.
Yep.
So there's a quote by Pétain that comes up in a minute, which just tells you everything you need to know about how the French did what they did. Like most armies, they had good kit and they had bad kit. You can't just sit there and say, well, it was all crap, because it wasn't. There was the argument that was made that their rifles were crap. they're 5-round bolt-action rifles. They were the same as the ones the Germans were carrying, more or less. And you're not even tinkering at the edges here. You know, you're talking about something that's just so small in terms of the overall scope of what could possibly go wrong for the French that it doesn't really matter. And if we take that argument to its logical conclusion, the British, later on in the war, should never have lost Singapore and Burma because the SMLE was better than the Arisaka. So it doesn't work as an argument. It's nonsense. Where the French do fall down a little bit, though, is in their equipment, most notably in a specific area of equipment that actually is one of the contributing factors to them losing the Battle of France, and that's in radio communication equipment. Where they had it, it was all right. It was kind of on par with everyone else's, but the problem was they just didn't have it. So when the French first group of armies under General Biot races into Belgium, quite a lot of the British officers noted that there was no means of communication between the different armies in that army group, even at army level. The French just didn't have radios. And because they're on the move, they can't rely on a telephone network that hasn't been created yet. So their only means of communication between their different armies was by dispatch rider. And they tended to either get stuck in horrendous traffic because refugees are coming towards you, so that obviously slows you down, or they get in road traffic accidents, or they get killed when they're on the move. And if they do reach you, they're usually pretty late. And you're only delivering a message. You've then got to wait for a reply and do the same on the way back. So this was a really poor. So where French equipment was really bad was in radio communications equipment. In the years leading up to 1940, the French spent 0.15% on radio communications, which tells you how high up their list of priorities they had this. They were solely reliant on fixed telephone lines and dispatch riders. And that 0.15% doesn't just cover the army, it covers the air force as well. And for the army, the vast majority of that 0.15% was spent in the Maginot Line, where the communications were excellent. It was generally regarded that the communications in the Maginot Line were brilliant, but it would be because they're not moving, they're fixed fortifications. So, you know. But other than that, French equipment was on a par with everybody else's. These weren't stupid people. It wasn't as if they didn't know how to equip an army. They just massively failed when it came to communications equipment. But the French lost, right? Absolutely they did. Yeah, absolutely. Comprehensively. But the main failures of the French way of war weren't strictly related to any of the myths that we've just gone through. The main French failure of war was command, control, and communications. And there was a disconnect between French army command down to corps level, and then draw a line, and anything below corps, you have a lot more effective. You have a lot more effective officers. You're talking about much smaller organizations. They're able to organize themselves. They're able to organize localized methods of communication. So it's the divisions, the divisional commanders themselves in the divisions that kind of hold everything together. They're the kind of glue that holds the French army in 1940 together. Because, frankly, they weren't getting it from the top. And the next one is obviously the Maginot Line. It did its job. The common jibe that you often hear is that the Germans just went round the side of the Maginot Line, and the French are like, oh my God, they've gone round the side. How do we not know this? They designed it, they procured it, they built it, they equipped it, and they staffed it. The French knew where the Maginot Line started and finished. They weren't thick. It was kind of supposed to do this. The reason why the Maginot Line is there is to protect French natural resources and their industry, and to focus French army attention on the bits where the Maginot Line wasn't. You only need to look at situation maps later on in the campaign to realize just how late the Germans managed to threaten the Maginot Line. It's very, very late on in the campaign. They can't really do it from the front. The units that did attack the Maginot Line didn't have a very good time of it at all. It's only very late on in the campaign they attack the Maginot Line from the rear. A significant proportion of the Maginot Line troops were still sat in their fortifications, thinking, "Oh, bring it on." But this doesn't mean that the French had this fortress mentality, which they're often accused of. The French had a problem in terms of defending their frontier that was a peculiarity of geography and natural resources. But they utilised the Maginot Line to its best effect, and where the Maginot Line wasn't in the terms that we normally think of it in these big cannon-armed fortifications, they were able to use their mobile forces, so their DIMs, so the Division d'Infanterie Motorisée, their motorized infantry divisions, their cavalry units, their DLMs, Division de la Guerre Mécanique. These were highly mobile, quite potent forces that they could move about the battlefield. The problem is they moved them about the battlefield in the wrong places, but that's kind of neither here nor there. And the French weren't fighting World War II with World War I tactics. What they were doing was applying the lessons they'd learned from the First World War with much updated equipment, gunnery, and everything to basically emphasize those lessons. So Pétain said "le feu tue," which basically means firepower kills. So he'd experienced how well firepower had killed, specifically at Verdun in the First World War, and now you've got guns that can make them even deaderer. So let's use those. So that's what the French do. They concentrate an awful lot on your artillery. This methodical battle was very heavily artillery based. It had a position in French doctrine that was similar to the position of artillery for the Normandy campaign. You only have to look at the battles around Caen, like Operation Totalize, where they physically stopped the operation to saturate the area with bombs and high explosive. You're seeing that in 1940. That's also the mentality that the French had. It's just that they applied it in the wrong place. And then, kind of finally, what I want to get at is this not a stroll through rural France. So this was a quote from Martin Alexander, who came up with a really fascinating paper about 2007, I think, just about the French performance in Case Red. And he says, "The German victory was not some kind of stroll in rural France, but came about only after some very hard fighting that had been lost from sight in most evocations of the fall of France." Done.
Yeah. No, I mean, great stuff, Tom. I mean, brilliant. I mean, excellent. As a French resident, I'm really glad to see that their performance in 1940 has been reassessed in a slightly more positive way. I say nothing changes the fact they did lose. I mean, we can't take that away. But then the Allies are losing for most of 1940 and 41 across the globe, as you said, Singapore. The list goes on. But we've got a couple of questions if you can address them. So. Gio Gamba is saying, did Germany's experience in Poland cause the French to alter their plans, revise their doctrine?
Weirdly, no, not really. The French were, like I said, there was an awful lot of stuff that happened that kind of reinforced this idea of where the Germans were going to attack. The French doctrine was effectively to absolutely batter whatever enemy it was they came across, and their defensive strategy was actually, for the units deployed, almost a defense in depth because of the way they deployed themselves. And I said, you've got this Comate, this kind of plugging tactic as well. They assumed that when the Germans were going to attack them with a blitzkrieg type attack, they could defeat it with the methodical battle. And the battles of the Jean Bleu Gap indicated that actually they were kind of right. The difficulty that they had was that they just deployed it in the wrong place. So they were, and when that happened, the French structure, the command and control and communications were so rigid that they couldn't react in time. One of the things I was going to mention, which I didn't actually, was that whilst the Germans had gained an awful lot of experience from Poland in their flexibility, and they'd updated the way they were doing things, contrast that with the French, that in Case Yellow, it typically took 48 hours from the point an order is issued at the French High Command to the point it's executed on the ground. The Germans are miles away at that point. They're gone. And it's that inflexibility that they did nothing to change. When they saw kind of Poland, they didn't really do anything because they were like, well, we know how to defeat them. We've done it before. We'll do it again.
Brilliant stuff. And another couple of quick ones. I want to finish this within about 5 minutes. So Peter O'Connell is saying, had the months-long delay in hostilities due to the phony war degraded French readiness?
It depends. It depends on the units. The B reserve units and some of the other reservists, yeah, they got bored. They weren't like proper soldiers. Oh, so they weren't proper soldiers. A lot of the B reserves fought very well. However, an awful lot of them were like, well, this isn't what I do for a living, and I'm kind of bored of sitting in a freezing cold barrack block somewhere. So, yeah, it curtailed an awful lot of... What it did do was curtail an awful lot of the field exercises because it was just too damn cold. And the French kind of resigned themselves to barracks when it was too cold. And, yeah, they sat around basically annoying themselves and annoying the Germans whenever they could. Yeah. Not really much in the way of military exercises in any meaningful sense.
Thank you. And that brings us on to the next question, which you've kind of part answered. Did the French not hold any large-scale war games exercises where they could have practiced moving large forces into Belgium and arranging communications?
Yes,
I guess pre-war we're talking here.
You kind of have to understand that they were developing... One of the things they were doing in the run-up to the Second World War was they were trying to work a way around, an effective way around, the fact that in 1936 the Belgians had withdrawn from this pact and it had kind of thrown all of their plans in disarray. They'd spent an awful lot of money on the Maginot Line. Now they kind of had to make it work. So they were very much preoccupied with that. Yes, French units did large-scale exercises. That's how you get the Corps de Cavalry moving quite effectively, apart from one minor incident, but they move quite effectively through Belgium. And when they meet the Germans, they kind of know what they're doing. You know, this wasn't an accident. These were reasonably well-trained men. As I say, the main problem is command, control, and communications, and they just moved the men in the wrong place initially.
Okay, thanks. We're getting lots of questions about air power and things like that. So I think if you're happy to, we can invite you back to do a second one about what was going on in the air as opposed to on the ground there, if you'd like to do that, because I don't want to derail it. A couple of questions, and maybe you can do this later, is Gregory saying, can you give us some book recommendations so I can add them to the description later on? So you can email me them and I'll add them later on.
Yeah, we'll just say I'm a big fan of Robert, I think it's Robert Doughty. I've got his book here. Robert Doughty, yeah, he's written a couple of books on the French campaign. He's an American army officer. They're excellent. And then, as I say, the Martin Alexander paper from 2007, if you can get it, it's on JSTOR, right. I think.
And then my last comment really is, and Stuart Burbage is saying, this is a brilliant myth to bust because it has taken such deep root. I mean, you've only got to speak to the Normandy guys, as I'm one of, my other half is. It's a commonly held idea that the French ran away in 1940. That's what a lot of people come here and say, you know. So, you know, you show them the figure of 90,000 dead in 1940 for a start, which kind of tends to sway that argument.
Focus the mind, yeah.
But I think this is one of those ones, unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with. I don't think there's going to be much big switching of this. I think it's too deeply enrooted. Would you agree, or do you think there's hope?
I think there's a little bit of hope because there's some very good books coming out now about the historiography of 1940. And I think what we've got to try and do, very briefly, is get English-speaking people interested in what happens after Dunkirk, because that bit's fascinating. The case red bit is fascinating, and it would show a very different side of the French army, I think. And
we're back to that whole idea about the fact that French language books aren't often put into English and vice versa. So as you say, the British people, American people, there's just a general lack of. There's Robert Forsyth's book, Case Red, isn't there? I think which is quite good. But yeah, we need more information on this. So we'll bring you back basically. But folks, we'll leave it there. I'm going to finish just under the 30 minutes. 2 shows coming your way tomorrow. Normal length one. Doug Nash is better, so we're going to be talking about the events that he was going to be talking about, and we've got a second one later on. William Nance is coming on to talk about the 9th Army in the ETO, so we'll do that later. So thanks everybody for your questions, fantastic ones tonight. Thank you, Tom. I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge from WW2TV saying enjoy the rest of your Monday. Cheers everybody, bye.